Imagine a place where the sun sets in October and does not rise again until February. Imagine a place where the ocean is not water, but a moving, crushing wall of stone. A place where your compass spins uselessly because you are standing on top of the world. This is the Canadian Arctic. For centuries, sailors called it the White Void. It is quiet here. It is beautiful. And it is the largest graveyard on Earth. If you look at a map today, you see islands, channels, and coastlines. But in 1845, the top of the map was blank. The British Empire ruled the oceans. They had mapped the jungles of Africa. They had mapped the deserts of Australia. But the Arctic was a puzzle with a missing piece. They were looking for the Northwest Passage, a shortcut from England to China over the top of the world. Whoever found it would control global trade. It was the 19th century equivalent of going to the moon. And so, England decided to solve the puzzle once and for all. They didn't just send a ship, they sent a machine. They gathered the best scientists, the best sailors, and the most advanced technology the world had ever seen. They were arrogant. They were confident. They believed that British engineering could defeat nature. They believed that iron and steam were stronger than ice. In May of 1845, two ships sat in the River Thames, waiting for the tide. The HMS Erebus, the HMS Terror. Their names were taken from volcanoes and hell itself. Names designed to strike fear into the hearts of England's enemies. But on this voyage, they weren't fighting the French. They weren't fighting the Spanish. They were fighting something that couldn't be intimidated. They were fighting the cold. Leading them was Sir John Franklin. He was 59 years old. He was a little overweight. He was kind. He wasn't a young adventurer. He was a man looking for one last glory before retirement. As he stood on the deck, watching the crowds cheer, he must have felt invincible. He didn't know that he was looking at London for the last time. He didn't know that in 3 years, the men cheering on the dock would be searching for his bones. To understand why this tragedy was so shocking, you have to understand the ships. The Erebus and the Terror were not normal wooden sailboats. They were bomb vessels. They were originally built to withstand the recoil of massive mortars firing during war. Their ribs were thick oak. Their hulls were reinforced with iron plating. They were built like tanks. But Franklin had added something new. For the first time in Arctic history, these ships had engines. They took locomotive engines from the London railways and installed them in the belly of the ships. They had a retractable screw propeller. If the wind died, or if the ice started to close in, they could fire up the steam engine and punch their way through at 4 knots. It was a game-changer, or so they thought. Inside, the ships were designed for comfort. The British Admiralty knew the men would be stuck in the ice during the winter. So, they installed a primitive central heating system. Pipes of hot water running through the cabins to keep the temperature livable. They packed a library of 1,200 books. Dickens, the Bible, scientific journals. They packed musical instruments. Violins, flutes, even a hand-cranked organ. They packed china plates and crystal glasses. And then there was the food. This was the most well-stocked expedition in history. They carried enough supplies to last for 3 years. Maybe 5, if they rationed. 60,000 pounds of flour. 30,000 pounds of salted beef and pork. Thousands of gallons of rum and lemon juice to prevent scurvy. And the newest invention of the modern age, canned food. They carried 8,000 tins of soup, meat, and vegetables. This was supposed to be their secret weapon. Fresh meat in a can. No more rotting salted pork. It was supposed to keep them healthy. But there was a problem with the cans. A problem that nobody noticed on the docks of London. The lowest bidder had won the contract to make them. And in his rush to finish the order, he had been careless with the lead solder used to seal the lids. Every time a sailor opened a can of soup, he wasn't just eating dinner. He was eating a tiny microscopic dose of neurotoxin. The ships were bomb-proof. They were ice-proof, but they had brought the enemy on board with them, packed neatly in boxes in the cargo hold. A ship is just wood and iron. It is the men who breathe life into it. There were 129 men on the expedition. Most of them were young, Englishmen from the countryside. Boys, looking for adventure. But the officers, they were a complicated mix. If Sir John Franklin was the father figure, Captain Francis Crozier was the brain. Crozier was the captain of the HMS Terror. He was Irish. In the British Navy of the 1840s, being Irish meant you were an outsider. You had to work twice as hard to get half the respect. Crozier was arguably the best Arctic sailor alive. He had been to the North and the South Poles, but he was a bitter man. He had fallen in love with Franklin's niece, Sophie, and she had rejected him. He sailed into the ice with a broken heart, perhaps hoping the silence would help him forget. Then there was Commander James Fitzjames, the captain of the Erebus. He was the opposite of Crozier. He was young, charismatic, handsome, and charming. He was the golden boy of the Navy. He wrote letters home joking about the trip. He thought it would be a grand adventure. He packed his dress uniform because he expected to have dinner parties on the ice. He had no idea that his uniform would eventually be found cut to pieces, lying in the snow. And below them were the crew, stokers for the engines, ice masters, marines. There was John Torrington, a 20-year-old stoker. There was Harry Goodsir, the assistant surgeon, a gentleman who wanted to study the biology of small sea creatures. They trusted their captains. They trusted the Empire. They signed the papers, took their advance pay, and wrote their last letters to their mothers and sweethearts. Reading those letters today is heartbreaking. They are so full of hope. "We will be home by 1848, one wrote. "The weather is fine," wrote another. "Not a single man on those 2 ships imagined disaster. Disaster happened to other people, not to the Royal Navy. They were simply too big to fail." The expedition left England on May 19th, 1845. They stopped briefly in Greenland to pick up fresh supplies and send their last letters home. 5 men were sent home here. 5 lucky men. They were sick, or they were disciplined for bad behavior. They were kicked off the ship. They must have been furious at the time. They must have felt like failures. They didn't know that being fired was the only thing that saved their lives. In late July 1845, the ships entered Baffin Bay. This is the gateway to the Arctic. Here, they met two whaling ships, the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise. The captains hailed each other. They invited the whalers aboard for dinner. The whalers reported that Franklin's crew was in high spirits. They had plenty of food. The engines were working. They were waiting for the ice to open up so they could sail into Lancaster Sound. The whaling captain watched them go. He saw the two black hulls, the smoke from their funnels, and the Union Jacks flying proudly from the masts. He watched them sail west, into a massive bank of white fog. He turned his ship around and went back to fishing. He was the last European to ever see them alive. Once they entered that fog, silence fell. 1845 passed. No news. 1846 passed. No news. 1847. At first, England wasn't worried. They are wintering over, people said. They have food for 3 years. They are fine. But Lady Franklin, Sir John's wife, began to worry. She sat by the window in London, looking at the moon, knowing it was the same moon shining on the ice. She started to ask the Admiralty, why haven't they written? But the men couldn't write. Because they had already entered the trap. They sailed well for the first season. They made good progress. But as winter approached in late 1845, the temperature dropped. The ocean began to thicken. It turned into a slush, then a soup, and then concrete. Winter comes fast in the Arctic. By September 1845, the water froze. The Erebus and Terror could go no further. They found a small, sheltered harbor at a place called Beachy Island. This would be their home for the next 9 months. They shut down the engines. They dismantled the sails. They built walls of snow around the decks to insulate the ships. Life wasn't bad at first. It was like a long holiday. The heating system kept the cabins warm. The men had classes. They learned to read and write. They put on plays. They explored the island. They built a blacksmith shop on the ice. They built a shooting range. They were bored, perhaps, but they were safe. But in the sick bay, something was wrong. Young men, strong men, were getting sick. They were losing weight. They were coughing. Their minds were foggy. The doctors, Dr. Stanley and Dr. Goodsir, were confused. They diagnosed it as pneumonia or tuberculosis, and in 1846, tuberculosis was a death sentence. On New Year's Day, 1846, John Torrington died. He was 20 years old. 3 days later, John Hartnell died. He was 25. Then William Braine, 3 deaths in 1 winter. It wasn't a catastrophe, but it was ominous. Why were these young stokers dying so fast? They decided to bury them on the island. But you cannot dig a grave in the Arctic. The ground is permafrost, frozen solid as rock. It took them days to chip out 3 shallow holes, just a few feet deep. They dressed the boys in their best clothes. They wrapped them in blankets. They placed a simple wooden headstone over each grave. And they left them there. Those 3 graves on Beachy Island are the most famous graves in polar history. Because the ice didn't decompose them. It preserved them. When scientists opened those coffins 140 years later, John Torrington looked like he was sleeping, and his body held the clue, the chemical fingerprint that explained why the expedition was doomed from the start. July 1846, the sun returned. The ice cracked. The channel opened. The crew of the Erebus and Terror must have been ecstatic. They had survived the first winter. They left the 3 lonely graves on Beachy Island behind and sailed south. Franklin made a bold choice. He turned his ships into Peel Sound. On the map, it looked like a straight shot to the open ocean. But Peel Sound is deceptive. What Franklin didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Peel Sound is a funnel. The massive, thick polar ice pack drifts down from the north and gets squeezed into this narrow strait. It piles up. It creates pressure, ridges 20 feet high. It is an ice factory, and Franklin sailed right into the middle of it. By September, the trap slammed shut. Just off the coast of King William Island, the temperature dropped. The slush turned to stone. This wasn't like the harbor at Beachy Island. There was no shelter here. They were in the middle of the open sea, miles from land, locked in a chaotic, jagged field of ice. The pressure was immense. Imagine the sound. Day and night, the ice groaned and screamed against the hull. The ships tilted on their sides. The floors were never level. You couldn't put a cup of tea down without it sliding off the table. The men tried to sleep while the ship shuddered around them, sounding like it was being crushed by a giant hand. They prepared for a second winter. It's fine, they told themselves. We have food. We have coal. The ice will melt next summer. But this time, the mood was different. They were further north. It was colder, and the lead poisoning was beginning to take hold. Lead is a neurotoxin. It attacks the brain. It makes you lethargic, paranoid, irritable. The officers began to argue. The men began to have strange dreams. The discipline of the Royal Navy began to fray around the edges. And as the sun went down for the second time, plunging them into 4 months of darkness, they realized they were truly alone. Summer of 1847 arrived. The crew waited. They watched the ice every day. They measured it. But it didn't melt. The summer was unusually cold. The Peel Sound trap held firm. They were not going anywhere. And then, tragedy struck the heart of the expedition. On June 11th, 1847, Sir John Franklin died. The exact cause is unknown. Perhaps the lead poisoning weakened his heart. Perhaps the stress of the entrapment killed him, but the effect on the crew was devastating. Franklin was their anchor. He was the optimism of the mission. With him gone, the reality of their situation crashed down on them. Captain Crozier took command. He was a realist. He looked at the coal supplies, dwindling. He looked at the food, tons of it, but the men were still getting sick. They didn't know the food was the poison. He looked at the ice solid as far as the eye could see. He realized that a third winter was coming, and he knew that the ships would likely never sail again. A third winter in the Arctic is a death sentence. Scurvy begins to rot the guns. Old wounds open up. The morale collapses. Crozier had to make a choice. Stay with the ships and wait for a miracle, or abandon the safety of the wooden walls and walk. The nearest outpost was hundreds of miles away at Backsfish River. To get there, they would have to drag heavy lifeboats over the pressure ridges. They would have to walk through minus 30-degree winds. Without proper winter clothing, they wore wool, not furs. Dragging sick men. It was a suicide mission. But staying was suicide too. For 10 months after Franklin died, they waited. They endured the third winter. More men died. 9 officers, 15 sailors. The death toll was accelerating. On April 22nd, 1848, Crozier gave the order. Abandon ship. They packed their bags. They loaded the sledges. They nailed the ship shut. And they stepped onto the ice, never to return. Before they started walking, they left a message. They walked to Victory Point on King William Island. There was already a cairn there, a pile of rocks left by a previous explorer years earlier. They opened it. They took out a standard Admiralty form, and they wrote their epitaph. This piece of paper is the most famous document in Arctic exploration. It tells a story in 2 parts. The first message, written in 1847, is optimistic. All well. But the second message, written in the margins a year later, is a eulogy. HMS Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd of April, having been beset since the 12th of September 1846. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. Start on tomorrow, 26th, for Backsfish River. Look at the handwriting. It is shaky. It is erratic. Graphologists who have studied it say it shows signs of extreme stress and neurological damage. The lead, the scurvy, the fear. It is the writing of a man who knows he is signing his own death warrant. 105 men stood there. They turned their backs on the ships, their only homes for 3 years. They looked south. All they could see was white ice, white sky, white death. They strapped the harnesses across their chests. The sledges, loaded with supplies, weighed 800 pounds each. Heave, and the death march began. Logic says that when you are fighting for survival, you travel light. You take food. You take guns. You take shelter. You leave everything else behind. But the Franklin crew did the opposite. When searchers found one of their lifeboats years later, they were baffled by what was inside. They were dragging hundreds of pounds of garbage. Heavy, sterling silver cutlery stamped with the officers' crests. Why? Did they expect to host a formal dinner party on the ice? Silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, slippers, a copy of The Vicar of Wakefield. Curtain rods. Why would starving men drag this weight? 2 reasons. First, lead poisoning. It damages the judgment centers of the brain. They weren't thinking clearly. Second, identity. They were Royal Navy officers. They were civilized men. Holding on to that silver spoon was a way of saying, I am not a savage. I am a gentleman. They clung to the symbols of their civilization, even as those symbols dragged them to their graves. The weight was fatal. They burned thousands of calories an hour pulling those sledges. But they were only eating small rations of tainted food. Their bodies began to eat themselves. Muscles dissolved, teeth loosened. And one by one, the weakest men began to drop. The Arctic was not empty. People had lived here for thousands of years. The Inuit. They knew how to survive. They wore caribou furs, not wool. They ate fresh seal meat, not tin cans. And they watched the tragedy unfold. Years later, when searchers asked the Inuit what they saw, the stories were horrifying. One hunter remembered seeing a group of Kabaluna, white men. He said they looked like ghosts. Their faces were black with frostbite. Their eyes were wild. They were dragging the heavy boat, chanting a strange song. He approached them. They made signs that they were hungry. He gave them some seal meat. But there were too many of them. He was afraid. He left in the night. Another group found a tent later that season. Inside, they found bodies. But not just bodies. They found boots that had been cut into strips and boiled. The men were trying to eat leather. They found gold watches scattered on the snow, useless trinkets that couldn't buy a single piece of bread. The Inuits spoke of a leader, Agluka, the Strider. They said he tried to speak to them. He pointed south. He tried to trade a knife for food. But the language barrier was a wall as high as the ice. The Inuit couldn't support 100 starving men. They had families to feed. So they watched the strangers walk away into the fog, walking toward a death that the Inuit knew was inevitable. As the weeks passed, the discipline broke. The officers could no longer control the men. The food was gone. The leather boots were gone. There was only one source of meat left, the dead. For a century, Victorian England refused to believe it. British sailors would never do that, they said. They would die with dignity. But the bones tell the truth. In the 90s, scientists found bone fragments on King William Island. They found cut marks, distinct knife marks consistent with defleshing. They found pot polishing, the smooth ends of bones that had been boiled in a metal pot. They cracked the long bones to get to the marrow. Imagine the horror. These weren't enemies. These were friends, brothers. They had lived together for 3 years. To take a knife to the body of a man you joked with, played music with, it broke their minds. It was the final descent into hell. They weren't men anymore. They were creatures of pure survival. The cannibalism didn't save them. It only prolonged the agony. The group split up. Some tried to go back to the ships. The Inuit found tracks heading north. Some just sat down and refused to move. The death march became a trail of scattered corpses stretching for miles. Years later, searchers found the final resting place of the main group. They called it the Boat Place. It was a lifeboat, mounted on a sledge, pointed north. They had given up. They were trying to go back to the ships. Inside were two skeletons. One skeleton was wrapped in furs. He likely died of hypothermia. The other skeleton was sitting up. Next to him were two loaded shotguns. Why loaded? Was he guarding the last of the food? Was he guarding himself against the other men? Or was he waiting for a wolf? Around the boat, they found the pile of useless treasures. Gold watches, silver forks, and books. One book, a Christian devotional, was found open. A page was turned down. It was a prayer for mercy. But on that wind-swept plain there was no mercy to be found. This was the end of the main group. Froza, Fitzjames, the officers, they died here, surrounded by their silverware and their silence. But the mystery didn't end with their deaths, because the ships vanished. Back in England, the silence was deafening. 1848 passed. 1849. 1850. No news. The Admiralty wanted to declare the men dead and move on. But Lady Jane Franklin refused. She became the most famous woman in the world. She spent her entire fortune funding rescue missions. She shamed the government into acting. Because of her, the greatest search and rescue mission in history began. Over the next 10 years, more than 30 expeditions were sent to find Franklin. They didn't find him, but in looking for him, they accidentally mapped the entire Canadian Arctic. They found the Northwest Passage. Franklin failed to find it, but his ghost led others to it. In 1854, an explorer named John Ray finally found the truth. He didn't find the ships. He found the Inuit who had the silver forks. He brought the story of cannibalism back to England. England was furious. Charles Dickens wrote angry articles calling the Inuit liars. Englishmen would never eat each other. They destroyed John Ray's reputation because he told them a truth they couldn't handle. Franklin was declared a hero. Statues were built. The cannibalism was erased from the history books. The story became a noble tragedy. And the ships, the Erebus and Terror, became legends. Ghost ships that had simply disappeared into the mist. Until 2014. For 160 years, the ships remained lost. But the Inuit oral history remembered. The Inuit elders kept saying, "The ship is there, near the island." Western scientists ignored them. They looked in the wrong places. Finally, in 2014, they listened. They moved their search area to where the Inuit said the ship sank. On September 2nd, 2014, a sonar image appeared on the screen. It was unmistakable. A massive wooden ship, sitting upright on the bottom of the ocean. It was the HMS Erebus. 2 years later, in 2016, they found the HMS Terror in a bay nearby. The condition of the ships is haunting. The cold water has preserved them perfectly. The glass in the windows is still intact. Plates are still sitting on the shelves. Inside the Terror, the camera found the captain's desk. The drawers are closed. Inside those drawers are the logbooks, the paper documents that could tell us exactly what happened. Archaeologists are still working on the site today. They are slowly, carefully excavating the secrets. They believe the ink on the paper might still be legible. One day soon, we might read the final words of Captain Crozier. We might hear the voices of the ghosts after 170 years of silence. The Franklin expedition was a tragedy of arrogance. They thought they could conquer the world with machines, but the Arctic taught them a brutal lesson. Nature does not care about your steam engines. It does not care about your silver spoons. In the white void, we are all just flesh and bone. We know the men died. We know they ate each other. But why did they fall apart so completely? Why did seasoned Royal Navy officers lose their minds? The answer lies in a factory in London, months before the ships ever sailed. The villain of this story isn't the cold. It's a man named Stephen Goldner. He was the contractor hired to provide the 8,000 tins of preserved food. He was a businessman. He undercut the competition. He promised to deliver the massive order in record time, but to meet the deadline, he cut corners. In 1845, canning was new technology. The cans were made of wrought iron and sealed with lead solder. The process required precision. You had to seal the outside without letting the metal touch the food. But Goldner's factory was a sweatshop. Workers were rushed. Forensic analysis of the cans found on Beechy Island reveals the truth. The soldering was thick, sloppy, and careless. Large beads of lead, some as big as marbles, were found inside the cans. The expedition carried thousands of gallons of soup and acidic foods like tomatoes. The acid in the food dissolved the lead pellets over time. Essentially, the men were drinking a lead-infused cocktail every single day. But lead poisoning, plumbism, is tricky. It mimics other diseases. It causes fatigue, depression, paranoia, and anorexia. This explains one of the greatest mysteries of the expedition. Why did men starve to death while they still had food? Survivors of lead poisoning report a total loss of appetite. The stomach shuts down. So, you have men hauling 800-pound sledges, burning 6,000 calories a day, and their brains are telling them not to eat. They were literally wasting away, surrounded by piles of food that was slowly killing them. Lead does more than destroy the body. It destroys the mind. At high levels, it causes hallucinations. Imagine being trapped in the dark for 4 months. The wind is screaming. The ship is groaning. and your brain starts to lie to you. Men reported seeing ghosts. They saw rescue ships that weren't there. They heard voices in the wind calling their names. It also causes aggression. The stiff upper lip of the British Navy evaporated. We know from Inuit accounts that the strangers fought among themselves. There were likely mutinies that never made it into the logbooks. Small factions formed. The officers versus the crew. The walkers versus the stayers. Captain Crozier must have been fighting a war on two fronts. He was fighting the ice outside, and he was fighting the insanity inside. His own ship, and perhaps inside his own head. Even Crozier wasn't immune to the suit. The erratic handwriting on the victory point note. That tremor could be the first physical sign of his own nervous system shutting down. He was leading an army of ghosts. While the men were dying on the ice, the world was becoming obsessed. The Lost Franklin expedition became the biggest news story of the 19th century. It was the Titanic of its day. The public demanded answers. Songs were written about Lady Franklin's lament. Plays were performed. The government offered a reward of £20,000, millions today, for any information. Admirals sent ship after ship. But the Arctic is vast. It is a labyrinth of 36,000 islands. Finding two ships in that maze is harder than finding a needle in a haystack. It is finding a white needle in a pile of snow. Many of the rescue ships almost suffered the same fate. The HMS Investigator got trapped in the ice. Its crew had to abandon ship and be rescued by another rescue ship. The Arctic was claiming more victims just for looking. One ship, the HMS Resolute, was abandoned in the ice. But the ship didn't sink. It drifted on its own. An American whaler found it a year later, floating 1,200 miles away. They sailed it back to England as a gift to Queen Victoria. Fun fact, the timber from that ghost ship was carved into a desk. The Resolute desk, which sits in the Oval Office of the White House today. A piece of the Franklin rescue sits in the room where the U.S. President works. The British Navy failed to find Franklin because they brought their arrogance with them. They refused to learn from the locals. But one man was different. Dr. John Ray. He was a Scottish doctor, working for the Hudson's Bay Company. He respected the Inuit. He learned their language. He learned how to build igloos and travel light. In 1854, while mapping the Boothia Peninsula, he met an Inuit hunter named Inuk Pujajuk. The hunter told him, "A party of white men starved to death a few years ago." And then he produced the evidence. A silver spoon with Franklin's crest. A medal belonging to Crozier. A gold watch. Ray bought the items. He knew immediately what they meant. Franklin was dead, but the hunter told him something else. He described the bodies found by his people. From the mutilated state of many of the bodies, and the contents of the kettles, it is evident that our wretched countrymen had been driven to the last dread alternative as a means of sustaining life: cannibalism. Ray, being an honest man, wrote this in his report to the Admiralty. He thought he was reporting a tragedy. He didn't realize he was starting a war. When John Ray's report was published in the Times, Victorian England went into shock. Cannibalism? Among the Royal Navy? Impossible. The savages might eat people, but not Englishmen, not Christian officers. The backlash was brutal. Leading the attack was none other than Charles Dickens. Dickens wrote powerful articles attacking Ray. He argued that the Inuit were liars. He suggested that perhaps the Inuit had killed the men and eaten them. He created a narrative of the noble savage being treacherous. Lady Franklin joined the attack. She refused to believe her husband's men had descended to such a level. She wanted them to be heroes, not cannibals. John Ray was the only major explorer of his era not to be knighted. He was shunned by society. He had solved the mystery. He had found the fate of the expedition. But because the truth was ugly, society punished the messenger. It took 150 years for history to apologize to John Ray. Because, as forensic science would later prove, he was right. Lady Franklin refused to accept Ray's story. She wanted proof. She funded one last ship, the Fox, led by Francis McClintock. In 1859, McClintock's men reached King William Island. They found the trail of death. They found the skeleton in the steward's uniform. They found the boat with the two bodies. And crucially, they found the cairn at Victory Point. Lieutenant Hobson found the note. It was rusted, damp, but when he unrolled it, the history of the lost years was revealed. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. This piece of paper was the smoking gun. It confirmed the dates. It confirmed the abandonment. It confirmed that John Ray was right about where they went, even if Lady Franklin didn't want to hear about how they died. McClintock returned a hero. He brought back the note. He brought back the relics. The mystery was officially solved. Franklin was dead. The men were dead. They died trying to walk to safety. The cannibalism was whispered about, but largely ignored. The story was codified into a legend of brave sacrifice, and for the next century, the snow covered the rest of the evidence. For 100 years, the story slept. Then, in 1981, a Canadian anthropologist named Owen Beat decided to use modern science to check the facts. He walked the same ground the sailors walked. He found human bone fragments scattered on the surface. He brought them to the lab. The results changed everything. The bones contained lead levels that were catastrophic. Beat realized that lead poisoning wasn't just a side effect. It was likely a primary cause of the disaster. But he needed soft tissue to be sure. Bones can absorb lead from the soil. He needed hair. He needed organs. He needed to find someone who hadn't decomposed. He turned his eyes to Beachy Island. In 1984, Beat got permission to exhume the 3 men buried in the first winter. Torrington, Hartnell, Brain. The digging was slow. They used warm water to melt the permafrost inch by inch. When the coffin lid of John Torrington was raised, the face that looked back at them became the defining image of the Franklin expedition. He was perfect, except for the fact that he weighed only 88 pounds. He had been wasting away before he died. He took samples. The autopsy confirmed it. Pneumonia, tuberculosis. But the lead levels in his hair were 600 ppm. Fatal toxicity. The expedition was doomed in year 1. They just didn't know it yet. Science solved the medical mystery, but the geographical mystery remained. Where were the ships? Explorers had looked for 150 years in the northern part of the search area. They found nothing. Enter Louis Kimokak. He was an Inuit historian. He spent his life collecting the oral histories of his elders. The stories passed down from grandfather to grandson. The elders said, "No, the ship isn't north. The ship is south, near the island we call Kekatenko." The Western experts were skeptical. "Oral history is just stories," they said. "It changes over time." But after years of failure, Parks Canada decided to listen. They moved their search grid south to the area Louis pointed out. It was a shallow bay. Dangerous for ships, unlikely. They dropped the sonar. Almost immediately they saw it, a massive wooden wreck, standing proud on the bottom. It was the HMS Erebus. It was exactly where the Inuit said it was. The stories were actually precise navigational records, preserved for 160 years. 2 years later, in 2016, they found the HMS Terror. But the location was shocking. It was in Terror Bay, ironically named years before. It was far south of where the ships were abandoned, and it was in a sheltered harbor. This implies something incredible. The ships were supposed to be deserted in 1848, but the Terror was found anchored. Ropes were used to secure it. Ships don't anchor themselves. This suggests a rewrite of history. Did some of the men, perhaps Crozier himself, return to the ships after the march failed? Did they fire up the engines one last time and try to sail out? Did they live on the ship for another year, dying one by one in the dark? It changes the end of the story. It wasn't a sudden mass exodus. It was a lingering, chaotic, drawn-out struggle. Maybe the last survivor didn't die in 1848. Maybe he died in 1850. Or 1851, alone on a massive ship, surrounded by the bodies of his friends, waiting for a rescue that was just a few years too late. Today, divers are exploring the interiors. Because the water is so cold and dark, there are no wood-eating worms. The preservation is spooky. Tables are still set. Guns are still in their racks. Boots are sitting by the bunks. It looks like the crew just stepped out for a smoke. But the Holy Grail is the desk. Captain Crozier's desk is intact. The drawers are closed. Inside, sealed by the water and the silt, are likely the ship's logbooks. Paper can survive underwater if it is buried in sediment. If divers can retrieve those books, and if conservators can separate the pages, we might read the daily diary of the apocalypse. We might learn exactly when Franklin died. We might learn who the first cannibal was. We might learn what happened in those final, desperate years that have been blank for a century. The story isn't over. The final chapter is still waiting in a drawer at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. There's a final, bitter irony to the Franklin story. Franklin died trying to find a route through the ice. He failed because the ice was too thick. Today, cruise ships sail through the Northwest Passage. The ice is melting. Climate change has done what the Royal Navy could not. It has opened the road. Tourists now pay thousands of dollars to visit Beachy Island. They drink champagne and look at the graves of Torrington, Hartnell, and Brain. The White Void is becoming a tourist destination. But the ghosts are still there. The melting ice is revealing more artifacts every year. Boots, bones, bits of wood. The Arctic is finally giving up its dead. Why does this story haunt us? Why do we keep making TV shows, writing novels, and singing songs about 129 men who died 170 years ago? It's because it touches a primal fear. The fear of nature. The fear of being slowly erased. It is the ultimate locked room mystery, but the room is the size of a continent. In Canada, it is a national myth. The song Northwest Passage is like an unofficial anthem. For just one time, I would take the Northwest Passage / to find the hand of Franklin reaching for the Beaufort Sea. Franklin is no longer a man. He is a symbol of exploration, of ambition, and of failure. Fiction adds monsters, the Tumbak. But the true story doesn't need a monster. The monster was the lead. The monster was the cold. The monster was the despair that turns a man into a cannibal. Reality is scarier than any ghost story. Before we leave the ice, let us remember who they were. They were not just skeletons. They were Harry Goodsir, who loved biology and drew beautiful pictures of shrimp. They were John Torrington, a 20-year-old from Manchester who just wanted to see the world. They were James Fitzjames, the orphan who invented a hero's backstory for himself and died trying to live up to it. They were Francis Crozier, the heartbroken captain who stayed with his men until the bitter end. They sailed for glory. They found only death. But in their failure, they achieved immortality. They are the eternal guardians of the passage, frozen in time. Forever young. Forever waiting for the ice to open. The Arctic is silent again. The wind has scrubbed the footprints away. But if you listen closely to the stories of the Inuit, or if you look closely at the sonar screens of the archaeologists, you can still see them. Dragging their heavy sledges into the mist, walking toward a horizon that never gets any closer. This was the voyage into the White Void. And for the men of the Erebus and Terror, the voyage never really ended.